Thanks for joining us, guys. Welcome to our webinar. We are discussing how to draft better agreements. So we've taken some time to look through your agreements, and in the past identified some of the areas that we've noted some problems with, or conversely areas where people have come and talked to us and sought some advice in terms of how to draft some specific clauses, and we thought it would be helpful to do some of this as a group. So here we are. A little agenda for the day. You guys saw the law school exam. Again, encourage you to think about how Princess Peach and Mario will best purchase that property that has been damaged by Bowser. And some of that will come up kind of as we go through the presentation. We're going to go through some pretty basic legal definitions, just to make sure that we're on the same page with, what is a term, what is a condition, what is a representation and a warranty. And I'm going to include some different examples, or we're going to include some different examples of what that looks like in your contracts, so you know exactly what we're referring to, and hopefully it's going to help the process of understanding kind of how you use them for the purposes that you're intending for. We're going to talk about some drafting strategies, the classic who, what, where, when, and why, and how, so that you guys can think in a little more depth around what we should be, or how you should be drafting some of these clauses, and hopefully have kind of a bit of an improved skill set after the presentation about how to manage some of these things. And then lastly, we'll put it into practice. So we will start talking about some of the, very common types of special terms and conditions that we see as part of our practice. And then hopefully that will spur some thought and some discussion as we finish it up. So yeah. Couple of disclaimers. The first big disclaimer: this is not legal advice. We are not acting as your lawyer. As noted, this is us trying to give you some tools to assist you when you know you should probably talk to us, but you've decided to ignore that thought anyway. So you decided to, instead of coming to us saying, Mark, can you please help us with this? Or Daniel, can you please help me with this? You're like, I got this, and I'm going to make it work. When things get messy, please come talk to us and let us help you out. The second big disclaimer is just about the lender. So as much as I would love to be able to just draft an elaborate clause that is going to meet the requirements of all legal precedent and the like, sometimes your lender gets nervous or confused or challenged by what we're trying to do, or it doesn't kind of fit the lending criteria that it will have. So you have to kind of make sure that as kind of a secondary piece of this, that you've worked with mortgage advisor broker to ask about whether or not the deal will work with the amendment that you're talking about. Some of the big, it could be that all of a sudden this changes from just an ordinary purchase to a purchase plus improvements, and maybe the work that needs to be done has to be done kind of as that plus improvement piece. Maybe there's something that has to happen with a holdback. Either it can only be held kind of to be directed to a contractor, or something like that. But any sort of cash back that goes to the purchaser is likely going to have the lending implication of reducing the purchase price, especially on insured deals. So just be very careful with that, and make sure that you're circling in the right people, because sometimes when you just kind of put this as a sneaky amendment, and then all of a sudden it comes on our desk and we've got 2 days to close it, and all of a sudden I've got to say, lender, there's a $5,000 credit that we got to talk to you about, then it gets messy in an awful hurry. And I've had a couple of those deals recently where it's been a challenge to close, and in fact we haven't closed some of them because the deal has changed so dramatically. So oops, back this up.
So I'll just, I guess, talk to you about some of the what terms mean. So in general, when you think about terms, you're thinking about, at least the way I look at it, is the agreement itself. What is included in the agreement? For example, the parties, the price, when it's happening, who has to do what to make the deal come together, in short. So in short, the terms are what the parties' understandings are. And I say the parties, I mean the purchaser and the seller, what their understanding of the transaction is put down in writing, in short. So in short, it's really the offer to purchase, the terms, and those are like really, I mean, like I said, the key things, price, date and time, what's also included, what's not included, just so that everyone is on the same page as to A, what the seller is selling, and B, what the buyer is buying.
And just to the section that we've included in the presentation here, if you're looking to add terms, this is the most obvious and easy way to do so. So on the offer, obviously, the additional terms, there's that section 3.2 that lets you add schedules. That would be the place where you would start adding some of those terms. You can also do it as part of an amendment, kind of after the fact, but those would be the two places. I guess the one kind of piece to this to point out is that you shouldn't put well, a condition can be kind of the terms, but I was going to say more the in thinking about it from a be aware, don't put kind of those terms that are supposed to subsist beyond the agreement or during the agreement as a condition. So something like a property condition disclosure statement comes to mind, where people will often have it as a hey, we get to review the conditions, but they want to also include it in the terms. And we're starting to see a lot of that now as a schedule, where people are saying, yes, you have this condition where I get to review the PCDS, but I also have it as a term where it say that it's included as the deal and incorporated as part of some of the representations made. So
conditions. In short, I mean, I guess the most basic way of and the best example is, for example, a lot of buyers will have unapproved, credit or approved financing condition. So in short, the deal won't happen unless these certain conditions, and usually they're, I mean, from a legal perspective, they're called conditions precedent. These things have to happen before the deal can come to fruition and close. So, for example, you'll have financing conditions. Sometimes you'll see conditions where the buyer has to have sold a property before they can complete the transaction. So these are the type of things that are in short deemed conditions to the transaction going ahead. So unless these things occur or are fulfilled, the transaction won't go ahead. And we've got a bit of an example here at the bottom. If you look at the PowerPoint, just kind of letting you know is like what kind of conditions exist. And sometimes I said generally these are buyer things that you want included, but sometimes sellers will have certain requirements. They'll require that that the buyer put a bigger deposit, or show some sort of documentation that they've got financing or something like that, to give them some assurance that what they're entering into is a deal that has a chance of closing.
I'm just going to put this on pause for 1 second, because it's showing that my battery is not charging, which would mean that this thing would automatically die, which wouldn't be great. No. There we go. Okay, there we go. Perfect.
All right, I guess we'll slide to the next slide here. Just gonna slide. So Marc's gonna probably talk to you about representations here a little bit.
Yeah, so representations are things that that are details that both from the past or from present, that you are representing to the other side about the knowledge that you may have about some element that's important to the transaction. So a property condition disclosure statement is probably the most obvious form of this. So there's a number of things that you are saying, this is my knowledge right now as to what the status is of the property. The distinction between that and something like a warranty would be that a warranty is something that is a little bit more prospective or future looking, in terms of you're promising that it's going to continue to be that way in the future. So in this case, I point you out again on 6.1 to your agreement. Here are all the things that are just representations, as opposed to into warranties. So that, for example, the land complies with the existing municipal land use bylaw, that the improvements are where they're supposed to be, that there's no kind of non-conforming buildings as described. That is kind of, the main representations in the offer. And then you've got, like I said, all the things that you'll see on the PCDS. And those representations it's to a standard, especially in the PCDS, as to what your knowledge was at the time that you executed it, as opposed to kind of a confirmation that it is. It's not like you're not warranting that for certain that it is that way right now. You're saying, to the best of your knowledge, it's that way right now. And then similarly, like we said, there's a number of warranties that are included that promise of kind of the present and future state. In the your standard contract, there's a number of different warranties that or language around warranties. So 6.2 talks about that they have someone has a right to sell the property, that they're not a non-resident of the property, and this is an important one for what's coming later, that the attached goods are owned by the seller and conveyed to the buyer, and that they're under normal working order and free and clear of any encumbrances. So when you're talking about rental, ACs and furnaces and all that jazz, this is saying, unless otherwise stated, that those things are owned free and clear. And you're providing that as a warranty to the purchaser, and unless otherwise noted. And then obviously I've deleted some of those kind of very common sections around, the equipment that is otherwise included.
I was gonna say, if I could jump in just real quick here, is I would say a lot of times your clients aren't going to read these things. So it's a fact. Yeah. They're not going to read them. So as realtors, it's important that you read them and ask multiple times. Also, another, especially and we'll talk about this a bit later. One of the key things, especially when you're looking to buy a property or even selling a property, is pulling the title. A lot of times the title will tell you if there's something there that may cause a problem down the road, and that's something maybe someone hasn't considered. So, I mean, I'll give you an example. I had a client of mine who had a Fairstone financial debt that they didn't realize or understand was registered on the title, which caused problems in terms of closing. But the title will also tell you if they don't recall certain things, that there may be things lurking in the background that have to be dealt with one way or the other.
Beyond that, I guess to the negative, there's a whole bunch of language in 6.3 and 4 and beyond that talks about, that the contract doesn't contain any other representation, warranties, or agreements unless otherwise specified. And then there's some language beyond that about the size and measurements of the buildings and the environmental condition and yada, yada, yada. They also note that the reps, warranties, and covenants shall not merge, which just means that you can rely on them kind of beyond closing. If, for example, it's been something that's been incorporated in the contract and you later find out that something is rented when you thought it was bought, that would be an example of maybe something that would then continue on post the closing. And again, another warranty about the end, the closing around the estoppel certificate. This is something under 6.6 that really you don't see kind of I don't think consistently, but resale condos that you warrant and agree that on closing the seller will provide to the buyer at the seller's expense documentation showing any material change in the estoppel certificate or additional items. I think people are relatively good about providing kind of any information if there's been a major change, but there is, just so you note, a warranty that is included in your agreement that says that you have to do that, and you have to do it at the seller's expense. So in thinking that through, I just want you to think about Mario and Princess Peach. And I'm going to back it up to just that presentation, or the example was. So Princess Peach and Mario deciding to buy a house from Mario. They know that Wario is a little sketchy, and they want to make sure that a few problems occur. There was some siding that needs some repairs after a recent flyby by Bowser in that reverse angry face helicopter thingy that he tends to drive around in, and they think that they should get some repairs done before possession. They will get it done before possession, but he can't be sure. He had a buddy out that told him that he should cost him about $2,000 in materials to fix the problem. What are some of the key problems? So, I mean, Daniel, what do you see as an issue in any of those things?
The Wario sketchy. That's the first thing that I see there. But all jokes aside, when you're talking about materials, making sure that you've got maybe a quote, the first thing.
Yeah, and what I was concluding with that specifically is, like, it's fine that it's $2,000 in materials, but is that really what you want the adjustment for, right? Like
Exactly.
it's going to be,
there's labor,
there's profit, there's all those things. So making sure that, you know, hey, if it's going to be that amount, that you know what exactly it's going to be the cost to you. I mean, the other thing being, you know, what type of person is going to be able to do the repair? You're going to get, you know, a qualified tradesperson that can confirm that the work's been done properly and kind of meets all those standard contractor requirements. Or is it going to be like Joe Schmo who decides that he's seen a YouTube video and he thinks he can handle it?
And also one of the big things too is, how do you confirm that the work's been done? So that's another issue, because, you know, that's well, it's one thing for someone to say that they're going to complete the work. It's another thing to confirm that the work has actually been completed. So those are the things that you want to, you know, look at and say, how do you confirm that the seller, for example, has done what they're supposed to have done prior to possession?
Yeah. See if it lets me go back.
So drafting questions. So I mean, there's no, I mean, when it comes to drafting, any kind of drafting, whether it's drafting terms in a real estate transaction or even a commercial transaction or a corporate deal, drafting is more of an art than it is a science, simply because every single transaction is different. There's different elements, there's different, you know, personalities, or different concerns and wants and needs of each party. So what we try to do here, and I just kind of, you know, giving ideas to what to think about when you're drafting, for example, an amendment, or you're drafting something that you want to add to the agreement, or making sure that at the end of the day, what both parties understand the agreement to be is articulated in the agreement itself. So, like we've got, say, who are the parties? What are the amendments, for example, if we're using an amendment example in this case, who is that supposed to benefit? Who's supposed to complete the action? What is the subject matter of this amendment, for example? Is it shingles? Is it siding? We got, and it's, you can never be too, I guess, too detailed with respect to what needs to be done. So, you know, when people say siding, what has to be, is it has to be replaced? Is it being repaired? You know, it doesn't hurt to articulate exactly what needs to happen and the what. And looking here down, if you look at it, what specifically is the outcome sought to confirm the work that has to be completed. So, you know, is it inspection by one of the parties? You know, before, you know, possession date, how many days before possession date, if that's an issue? Delivery of receipts to confirm that the work has been done. Or is it something that, for example, the realtor comes out to confirm that the work has been done? An execution agreement, something to show that the work has been done, it's warranted, and, you know, you can all go forward. So
yeah, and I was thinking about who. I mean, one thing that you've got to be thinking about as part of these agreements is like the important, we've described it as kind of privity of the contract. So who are the parties that are participating to the contract that you're involving yourself in? So, you know, just because the vendor has a contract with some contractor to do some repair doesn't mean that you as purchaser may get the entire benefit of that contract. If everything works out, then great. But if all of a sudden it's like, hey, I've done half the work and it's been paid for in full, and then they disappear, you know, your remedy is probably not against the contractor. It's probably against the vendor, who would then try to get the contractor involved by third party if that was an issue. But it's just important to kind of think whether the person that you want to be implicated through the agreement that you're drafting is actually implicated, and making sure that the right types of protections are in place to reflect the risk that that party is creating for you.
So where, looking at where does this have to occur? Is there something, you know, that the realtors or the lawyers have to confirm or get something, like, for example, like receipts, things like that? When is it to occur? Is it something that's supposed to occur prior to possession? Is there maybe a time frame post possession that something can occur. For example, if there's contractor schedules, etc., things like that. Consequences. If the actions aren't completed, what is to happen then? And this is really important for us as lawyers, so we know exactly what to happen. If, for example, the drop dead date is December 17th, we know as of December 18th, we can take steps to protect our client or move this thing along. The worst is when we get things that are vague or open to interpretation, because that way we're left kind of stranded trying to figure out how do we proceed? What's the best way to proceed? I mean, at the end of the day, as lawyers, we're always thinking worst case scenario, and we're also thinking if this thing goes past us having to go to, for example, to court, or someone gets sued or something like that, have we acted properly? Have we made sure we protected our client's interest? And have we run afoul of what is the intentions of the parties here? So these are things that when you're drafting, these clauses that that we think about, and we'd also like you to think about as well, because there's nothing worse than getting having a client that's unhappy, or having to as a result of a poorly drafted amendment, having to go to litigation and spend more money. No one's happy in those type of situations. So really, it's something that we just want you to consider. And sometimes it's not something, not every deal requires you to think in this type of to this depth, but it's something that we want you to keep in mind when you're drafting these things. And also the why. Why are we doing this? Are we protecting the buyer? Are we protecting the seller? What is the consequence? What is the consequence, in short, of us looking for this amendment? What is the result that we're looking to gain at the end of the day? So there's just things that, like I said, to keep in mind.
Back to the when piece. So lawyers, the way that we close transactions is through trust conditions, and trust conditions are supposed to be basically our execution of or our implementation of the contract as it was drafted. So when we get something that's vague and unclear, then we're less trying to kind of put into place what the contractual terms are, and more trying to create a contract that never existed in the first place. So the thing with like, for example, that when piece, when we've got a deal and it's closing on the 30th of the month, and you've got a clause that says, well, if there isn't, if we haven't got what we need by December 20 or by the 27th, then there can be a holdback in place. Well, it's very easy then at the 28th to go back to the other lawyer and say, hey, look, this hasn't been met. We have a very clear holdback clause. We're going to put the holdback in as part of the trust condition. And that's how we're going to close this thing, is based on the holdback that has been contemplated by the parties. And then when your guy gets his ducks in a row and can finally kind of meet that requirement, you can release those funds to your client, or we'll send it to you, or however the holdback is being structured. Versus when we get something where it's like, oh, this is going to be done by the 30th, and there's no clarity on how it's going to be done, or who's going to do it, or any of those things. We're not really in a position. I wouldn't accept, unless my clients gave me instructions that said, yeah, no, it's fine. You can do that, because we want them to feel comfortable. I wouldn't accept a trust letter that would say that there would create a holdback. And also, I don't think it would be necessarily appropriate in those circumstances to be asked to do that when there's been nothing created but through the contract itself.
So putting it into practice. So generally, like I said, we're talking about the who, what, where, when, why, and how. How do we put that into, how do we draft something that reflects the intentions, as Marc was talking about, a holdback? So one of the more common amendments is holdbacks. So generally, like I said, work needs to be done to a seller's property. If it's not done by this, by a certain date, at likely the seller's expense, a holdback is created to ensure that the work is done, and so that the buyer's happy with the product that they're getting, i.e. the house. So the things that we're trying to, that when you're drafting these things, trying to think about is, who's doing what, amounts, dates, how do you evidence the work being done, and what are the consequences if the work isn't done? Especially the tough thing a lot of times with holdbacks is a lot of times we'll get great early, like I guess the first part of the amendment is great in terms of laying out all those things, but the consequences sometimes aren't clearly laid out or are articulated. And 99% of the time or 98% of the time, this is not an issue. But the 1-2% of the time that is an issue, it can become a very big issue. You have, so for example, sometimes you'll have buyers saying, are we releasing the holdback? Are we getting the holdback? What's going on? And as lawyers, we're forced to, I guess, interact with each other to figure out how do we resolve this so that everyone kind of walks away, with happy and getting what they expected to get at the end of the day.
And I mean, the percentage that he's putting on, I think that was probably true, maybe pre-pandemic that it is now.
Yeah.
I mean, I've had the worst week of real estate I have had in probably 10 years of practicing law this week. And it's from deals either being rushed or deals being kind of sloppily put together, problems with financing, client not understanding kind of all the things that they would need for the deal to close. And I don't put that at your feet. I think it's kind of just a problem with the industry right now, and that everything is getting pushed and delays are happening and timelines are getting kind of stretched thinner and thinner all the time. But then when that happens, it just creates more possibilities of chaos at the end of the transaction, especially with a lot of this stuff. And I find that I've probably been dealing with more of these things as problems than I've ever dealt with in the past. Yeah.
So drafting a holdback clause, we're going to do, I'll give you a brief example, but this is, like I said, the things that you want to keep an eye out for. So I'll show an example of something that I drafted. It's not perfect, but like I said, we'll go through it together. And when you look when I show you the example, just look at the who, and we'll talk about that: the who, the what, the where, the when, the why. So the example where I'm going to use, and you'll see on the next slide, is a holdback of $5,000 for some shingles. So I don't think I've ever seen an amendment that looks like this, but and maybe you're thinking I've gone too far, or whatever. But as a lawyer, this is how I would draft something like this. And this is not, like I said, it's not perfect. I in any sort of other context, if I was doing a more extensive agreement, I would certainly dig into some of these issues a lot deeper. So for example, who's holding the holdback? The buyer. So the buyer's lawyer. Sorry, we've enunciated that. How much is the holdback? $5,000. What is the work to be done? So I've said remedial work, and I've put in brackets loose shingles. It's very important to detail what exactly has to be done. If it's changing a whole roof, loose shingles. Not to say you got to count the shingles, for example, but kind of say maybe loose shingles on the north side of the roof, or whatever.
Or
something
photos or
photographs.
Yeah.
That doesn't hurt either. Just something so that it's very clear what the holdback pertains to. A lot of times too, we'll get a $5,000 holdback and there's like 6 items. Well, what happens if there's 4 of the 6 done? How much are we holding back? Or how do we articulate that? How do we deal with that as lawyers on the back end? Someone says, well, we did 4 or 6. You're not holding back the whole 5. You want, 4. So there's a whole bunch of confusion that can happen if things aren't articulated and spelled out clearly. Sometimes you got to look at it as like, if I had to explain this to a 4-year-old, how would I do it? And list it that way. So for example, going to do, loose shingles. The remedial work is to be done by a professional company. And I put bracket or company X, or a company agreed to by the parties. A lot of times I'll see, remedial work to be done to a workmanlike standard. What does that even mean? I don't know what it means. Does it mean my cousin Harold comes down because he's got a truck and 2 hammers, he's doing the work? Or is it, a company that's been in business for 50 years that just does roofing? So it's important to, outline who, what is anticipated. If the parties can either, come up with a company, or they have quotes to say, this company is the company that's going to be doing the work, and you're happy that, everyone's happy that this is the company that's, the price point is right, etc. Great. So it's important to have that. Also, how do we prove the work has been done? So you see receipt, invoice, and that is something that evidences that the work has been done, and that it is obviously the amount or close to the amount that the holdback is set for. It should be it should be that amount. I assume you get a quote before you set a holdback amount, but I mean sometimes it doesn't happen. And how do we, like I said, who do we give the proof to? So proof is to be provided to the buyer's lawyer, and when. So we've got a date there and time. So if, as Marc was saying earlier, if I don't have something by December 16th, but 501, I can act. I can do something. I know what I need to do to move the ball along here in terms of getting this deal completed. That way, it limits questions and unhappy people at the end of the day. Also, what happens if, for example, I do get something? I do get the receipts before December 16th, in this example, by 5. Good. I can release the holdback to the seller's lawyer and say, "Oh, you guys you've completed what you need to complete. The deal closes, no holdback going to the buyer. Seller gets their money back because they've done the work, and everyone goes on their merry ways there."
Yeah, and I think the reason why we talk about like a little bit early in terms of the transaction is because we're not going to accept the trust conditions associated with the deal until we know how the deal is supposed to be structured. So if we can't, well, we can, but it would have to be by the good graces of the other law firm, create a holdback kind of after the fact. And so it's not in your client's best interest to all of a sudden be like, okay, well, we're going to hope that this all works out. And and so the deal's closing on time. And maybe if it doesn't work out, we'll see if we can get a holdback, but we're not sure if we can because there's nothing in the deal that provides for it. So it's really important as part of that piece of it to make sure that you give us a little bit of time to work with, so that we're not trying to do everything on the last day or having to have those negotiations at that point in time. One other thing, kind of, there's like I said, Daniel, there's a bunch of things that we could do with this clause that would make it more robust. So you've got to, like I said, this is an example, and based on the circumstances, maybe something would be better or stronger or the like. I look through this and I say, how one example you run into, especially with new homes, is whether or not the work that has been agreed to is done to the satisfaction of the individual who's purchasing that new home. Mm-hmm. And so often when we get those kinds of holdbacks, we're seeing language from the builder, and the builder saying, "Yeah, we'll hold back this amount until we tell our lawyers that the work has been completed." And it's fairly standard, to be honest. Yep. And that's fine if they're doing it in kind of a fair way and they've done the work. And the reason they do that is often because they get someone who's upset about the fact that maybe the paint touch-ups haven't been done, so they're not going to release the $10,000 slab or garage that's been completed. So that's the case. A lot of them, though, at times if you can push back, they'll consider either that both parties have to consent to it or the like. But it really depends on the builder. So that would be a good example of one of those times where it's important to be clear about who gets to give that final okay in terms of the transaction. Insurance claims. So as I'm sure many of us have been dealing with, there is a number of insurance claims that are still ongoing, even with properties that have been sold. It creates their own kind of special types of challenges, especially because they're usually in the midst of being resolved, and especially for roofing stuff. I understand that a lot of them, I've heard that you can't complete them after kind of a certain temperature change, so therefore there's really nothing that's happening on them for a period of time. I don't know if that's the case or not. That's just what I've heard. And so if that's the case, then you're in the midst where you've got this active insurance claim for a property that someone is no longer the owner of. So important things to think about there is whether or not your insurer has some sort of outcome that they dictate if all of a sudden you are no longer the owner of that property. Does it modify the coverage? Does it modify the payout? Does it modify if any coverage is in place? So sometimes that would be kind of your first discussion, is just to make sure that you understand as a vendor what you are actually able to commit to. And then secondly, you want to talk about who gets the benefit of some of those funds. You'll see in that clause of your contract down below, if loss or damage to the property occurs before the seller has paid the purchase price, then any insurance proceeds shall be held in trust for the buyer and seller according to their interests in the property. That is the most ambiguous clause that I could imagine for that. So I'm not really sure what that's saying, other than it's going to be held in trust subject to, whoever has an interest, which it just doesn't help.
No.
I'm not really sure what that's supposed to mean, to be honest. That's why if I was in that case, I'd want to be pretty clear about, the vendor is to receive will assign the proceeds to the purchaser, or, the vendor will pay for the repairs and use the proceeds for that purpose. That sort of thing. And that's the kind of that second main bullet point. Who gets the benefit of the funds? Who's responsible for getting the work done? And as a buyer, do you want the vendor to be kind of putting around with their own tradespeople in the property, trying to figure out how they're going to manage things or not? What happens if the claim is denied or the work is completed poorly? Is there kind of an ongoing obligation for the vendor to fix those things? Or is it, or are you limiting it through the contract to say that, that it will be, the repair will be done to the extent provided by the insurance company? Is there, who's responsible, I guess, for the deductible? That would be another thing that you would run into. Who is responsible for the risk associated with the project is kind of that overall concept. A couple of different clauses that I describe. So, the vendor agrees to repair siding defects described in Koopa Troopa's report dated June 15th, 2021, prior to August 1st, 2021. If the repairs are not remedied to the purchaser's satisfaction by that date, the purchase price shall be, and then whatever, $3,000 less. Or as an alternative, and which is kind of the flip side of it, vendor agrees to submit a claim for insurance for siding defects described in Koopa Troopa's report dated June 15, 2021. The vendor will assign any insurance payout payable under the claim to the purchaser. Purchaser will be solely responsible for the repair of the defects identified in the clause. So the one, it's fairly strongly on the vendor. One, it's fairly strongly on the purchaser in terms of the obligations that come along with that. And then again, the variations in this case are endless. So you really have to look at understanding what the vendor can do through their insurance, and then what they're willing to do, and then conversely on the purchaser side, what they're willing to put up with, and then lastly, when all that's sorted out, then what your lender is comfortable with is part of that process as well. Also, rented and leased fixtures. We've had a long history in the city of having water heater rentals as a pretty easy and simple adjustment. That has become more complicated in a couple of ways. One, there's starting to be companies that tend to be a little more formal about some of their requirements of assigning the contracts over from the vendors to the purchasers. They will want they'll want an assignment agreement. Often, for whatever reason, they're not willing to have us participate in that, but they kind of want to make sure that there's some level of formality to it. Good old Heaths used to just ask us who the new purchaser was, and we'd do an adjustment, and they'd send them a bill when the old bill was paid up to, and it would be kind of no harm, no foul. I understand the first, because I think that like Heath's model is there's a risk associated with it. Obviously it's worked to date for them, but I understand why someone would want to do an assignment agreement or an assumption agreement to make sure that that's set up properly. The second part of that, though, is we are seeing way more predatory lease companies that exist out there. And with that, you'll see somewhere there is, you're buying this for a huge price. They're financing it at ridiculous rates. There is a huge cancellation penalty, and it turns like a $4,000 purchase to a $15,000 or $20,000 debt that accrues over some period of time. And they know how to securitize some of those things, so they'll register things in on land titles, or they would have like a security agreement that's registered. And so, you know, there's a lot more that you can't just kind of ignore the fact that it exists as part of the deal closing. So the important part of that language that I was sharing before was showing that it is the seller who's conveying that the property is owned unless there is something in the agreement to the contrary. So, I mean, to Daniel's point earlier about making sure that you've asked those questions, you know, ask the big ones about the ownership status of some of these things. You know, if they ever say they've got monthly payments associated with some of this stuff, or they'll pay it out when it's done, or they'll just keep paying for it after the property is sold. That may not be an option for them, and it's important to make sure that you understand what exactly that looks like, because if the sale is tight and they don't have that money, then it gets awfully complicated in a hurry. So yeah, like I know, they'll register something on title. Sometimes they don't. Some will have assumption agreements. Some do not. Some have cancellation penalties. So just a couple of examples. So I put on the bottom a condition. So thinking about a purchaser who's coming into this, and you understand that there is kind of a rental agreement. So you'd find out from the other realtor that, oh, hey, there's this kind of rented property or water heater. I just want you have to sign an assumption agreement before we close it. And to note, I should back this up. Your agreements will contemplate whether or not, for example, the water heater is included in the purchase price. The contract is not super clear that if it is not included, that you are then required to assume that rental. So to put it a different way, what the agreement says is this stuff is owned, especially where it's noted, and it then lists kind of all those things that would normally be included. And then it says, well, water heater, not included. It does not then, as an additional term, say the purchaser agrees to assume the rental of that water heater. So when you've got these situations where there's kind of a community norm that purchasers will assume it because it's more convenient, and for the most part, if it's one of those companies that have been around forever, it's usually not a terrible deal. Then we just kind of let that happen, and we do an adjustment and so forth. But if you get one of these terrible contracts that you're having to deal with, a purchaser is very much in their rights to say, I'm not going to assume that contract. So as a vendor, you want to make sure that you say, hey, look, there's this thing, you kind of have to keep paying for it. It's going to be here for as long as you want. Or conversely, I'm getting rid of it and they're going to remove it and I'm going to pay whatever the cost is to get it out of there. At that point, I would expect a vendor to say, if it's going to be one of these kind of weird contracts, I'm wanting to see a copy of that lease or renter agreement and confirm it's acceptable to them, just like you would do with a rental agreement that you might have with a tenant if you're buying a rental property, right? Because it's going to be a pretty material cost. You want to see what the penalties are. You want to see how long you're on the hook for it. Kind of all those things that would come along with it. And then secondly, the term that you might include, this would be something that would be pretty vendor friendly, is the term that I included. They agree to assume responsibility of the rented water heater installed in the property by ABC Plumbing. The purchaser will sign the standard assumption agreement provided by ABC and provide copy the same to the vendor solicitor on or before whatever day. And then this last part's maybe that extra little oomph, is that the purchaser will indemnify the vendor for any claim made by ABC Plumbing now or in the future related to any cost, charges, or damages related to the use of the equipment. So just having even an extra level of I'm not responsible for this, you assume it, but if something does happen and they think they can sue me for it, you're still responsible for it. And so again, I think you'd be hard pressed to get that one through in some cases, or in most cases, but it's probably more protectionist for a vendor than you would often run into.
So at the end of the day, I mean, it's not so much that, like I said, every single amendment or contract that you have has to include the things. These are just things to think about. And like I said, I think with respect to the water heater thing, I certainly think that you should be including something about that. If, for example, if the water heater is not owned, there should be some sort of explanation as to what is to occur with the water heater. I know it's a lot more work, but like I said, it saves a lot of hassle down the road.
And yeah, I think if I'm thinking about it practically, like if you know it's a Heath's water heater and it's $150 as a one-time kind of annual cost, maybe there's fairly minimal risk to just kind of not deal with it that way. I think it's an easy fix to just make sure that it's clear. But if you're like, well, I don't know, this might cause whatever problem, then I can understand it. I think it's definitely when you've got a situation where it's beyond the $150 annual rental fee, that it becomes, that risk is increasing accordingly.
Or if you have a client that is incredibly detail oriented,
yes,
as I like to say, you may want to make sure that these things, or people who are even incredibly cost conscious, that these things are clearly laid out. There's nothing worse than me getting to a meeting and have a client upset about $60. Nothing worse than that. But so yeah, it doesn't hurt to have those type of discussions and make sure that these things are outlined in the offer to purchase.
Yeah. Well, we did pretty good time this time. If this is like an hour and a half last time, this works better with the same room.
Yeah.
We can kind of poke each other.
Yeah.
So I think we can probably open it up to questions, comments, and the like. Again, go for game sign up link in the chat. I highly encourage all of you, and I will pester some of you, I'm sure, to join us. Yeah, if you want, feel free to chime in, raise a hand, unmute yourself, and let me know if you've got questions.
I got a question. It's Jenny Fast. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Yeah, okay. So you had mentioned that like when it comes to holdback, that or you could adjust the price accordingly if the work isn't done. Wouldn't that be mortgage fraud then? Because you're adjusting the price a day or two before possession and they've already got financing for a certain amount on the house. So do they need to change their whole mortgage and financing?
And that might be a good example of something where it won't work because of the financing that would come along with it, right? So, and that was kind of big disclaimer number 2, was making sure that you've got that sorted out. If you're going to do something like that, then I would definitely suggest that you give us enough time and your broker enough time to go back through that channel to say, hey, by the way, there's going to be a pricing change. Here's the amount, no big deal. Conversely, if you've got, one of those deals where people are loaded and they're made of money and they're buying it like with a 20% of value, transaction, then maybe it's less of a problem. But you want to make sure that you give us a lead time to do that, especially if you're changing the pricing associated with it.
Okay, sounds good. Thanks.
Deb, I saw you popped up and then you disappeared on me. So see if you wanted to chat.
No, I'm good. Although I did send you a question there. We were talking about just the drafting of clauses and, obviously it causes you some frustrations and time when things aren't done specifically, and it leads to interpretation by various parties. Do you have any ability to, do lawyers in Saskatchewan have an ability to recommend to SRA that realtors perhaps need better education and skill set surrounding drafting of clauses in these offers? Because that really that is something that would be very valuable in our continuing education, but they've moved our continuing education to the, I guess, BC solder school does it, but
Yeah.
you know, those are type of things that make us better at our job.
You know, it's funny. I've had a couple of comments in that respect since advertising that we were going to do this presentation. One, kind of some discussion about creating some standards around some standard language around some of these issues. So, like, you know, in terms of whether it be holdbacks or the like, if the SRA needs to be kind of taking a lead to make sure that some of these issues are minimized as part of the closing process. And I think that's totally fair. I mean, this at some level is us seeing a problem and hoping to connect with enough people that we can start moving the dialogue around some of this stuff to being, you know, better drafted agreements, and hoping that that kind of takes hold, at least locally, in terms of the marketplace. But yeah, I think that's a fair comment. I think that, you know, I've been a member of the SRA since they've amalgamated. I'm being perfectly honest. I don't think I've really had much in terms of interaction with them since that's occurred. So I'd be happy to engage more. I just don't know that there's been a lot of kind of a lot of requests from feedback from our group or industry as part of the association.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's like, you know, like just a drafting of clauses, and then like I missed the meeting with Chris, the new president, or is that her name, Chris? Anyways, I forwarded my comments through Craig to her, because the other clause, section 6.2a, is it, where it says the seller is not a non-resident of Canada for the purposes of the Income Tax Act. I don't think a lot of agents, in my discussions with various people, understand the seriousness and the impact for that from a CRA perspective. And that I also think needs to be addressed. Yeah, because if you've got a non-resident, there's income tax complications, and then CRA can actually, I've learned, put a lien on the house, and it becomes the buyer's responsibility to pay those taxes on behalf of the seller.
Yeah, there was actually a decision out of BC a couple of years ago on this very issue, and like the lawyers got sued and the realtors got sued and everyone got sued because there was enough red flags around to ask the question as to whether or not that should have been a further inquiry that was made, and all those additional steps that you have to do were managed as part of the transaction. And so I think it was $120 some thousand that everyone kind of got on the hook for. But it's another kind of one of those points that we try to highlight, is just to say, yeah, you got to understand whether or not your clients are a non-resident, and getting those clearance certificates, and understanding then when you get those clearance certificates, or have to get those clearance certificates, how that can screw up the deal too, because there's a holdback requirement that we have to do as part of those things. And if we don't have enough money because your mortgage is too high relative to the value of the property, then it can really screw up how the deal is supposed to close.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so yeah, that might be a good topic for your next presentation to us, because these are excellent. Like, this was really valuable information today, you guys.
Good. Yeah,
I think we did talk about clearance certificates in the last presentation as well.
but yeah, we will.
Yeah.
GST is always kind of a nasty thing that, you know, I've been doing this long enough that, like, I feel equipped well enough to cause problems, but not to understand the solutions often, just because, like, it can be so messy when you get these acreages where there's a little hobby farm and someone's running a business on the side, and they, you know, they rent out whatever acreage associated with it, and or you've got, you know, guys selling lots that have been subdivided, and it just, there's lots of situations where GST can potentially pop up that I think there's a real hesitance generally to get that advice and to ask those questions, and I think often, to be honest, that realtors may not even be aware of the issues that surround it. So it's important to educate you guys too, so that you can, before you get to a point where it's like, okay, this is closing in 2 weeks, make sure that the necessary inquiries from their accountants and the like have been resolved, so that someone's not getting an unexpected GST bill.
Yeah.
Give you a few more minutes, but yeah, no. So we'll we'll answer any more questions you got. Always feel free to reach out to us, guys. We both are happy to take questions and kind of help manage the deals that you're going through. You know, I think both of us take it as just an important relationship building thing to have you guys be able to reach out when you need to ask us questions about this stuff. And in all honesty, even if it's not a deal that we're helping with right at this instance, we know that you're good to kind of, you know, refer the next one or whenever you can beyond that, that we're always happy to kind of help out on that front. So if, you know, you're dealing with someone who doesn't have maybe the detail of knowledge or the like, I don't mind. And I'm sure Daniel doesn't either.
Yeah.
So yeah, thanks for coming out. We appreciate it. And yeah, make sure you guys sign up for the Gopher Games happening December 20th. It is going to be a lot of fun. The first participant is going to be announced via my Instagram and my Facebook page this afternoon. And hopefully you guys can make it. So, okay, thanks so much. I think we'll end it here.
That's it. Yeah, good. Thanks, guys.
Thanks.